Hey, welcome to Ice Beta, a podcast about ice climbing, mixed, and dry tooling. I'm your host, Aaron Gary. In today's episode with Patrick Cooke, we talk about progressing in ice climbing with longevity in mind. Patrick is based in the Northeast and has been climbing for nearly 20 years. During that time, he has ticked hard classics all over New England, the Canadian Rockies, Québec, Scotland, and Hyalite Canyon. Some of his proud sends include Call of the Wild at Lake Willoughby in Vermont, Omega at Cannon Cliff in New Hampshire, and he was part of the first free ascent team for the Resistance, a 5-pitch M10 on Mount Washington in New Hampshire. Patrick is especially drawn to thin technical routes, weird mixed lines, and has begun to embrace more sport-style mixed climbing over the past few years. In his coaching, he focuses especially on head game strategies. Without further ado, enjoy the first episode. The first time you went ice climbing, you actually knew right away that that was what you wanted to do. What was it about the sport and the climbing that just attracted you to it?
Yeah, for me, I had started rock climbing summer 2005 on a Knowles course and came into that thinking, okay, I want to take that into mountaineering. And so it seemed like ice climbing, well, that's what you should do in the winter to prep for that. But much like rock climbing kind of caught me by surprise and how much I would love it, ice climbing was the same way. Really, I think the allure of it for me, there's something about the movement mechanics that just speak to me, that feel natural to me. I'm not a natural rock climber. I am not a particularly gifted rock climber. I would say I'm also not a particularly gifted athlete. Naturally, I have to really work hard for things that a lot of other people that I've interacted with, they get their bodies can do it. With ice climbing, the movement of ice climbing, I feel like I picked up pretty quickly. And there's also an allure to you're doing something, especially at a time of year when most other people aren't even willing to do it. Because if nothing else, the one thing I could bring to my climbing is a bit of stubbornness, that persistence, right? And a willingness to put in work, and a willingness to suffer a little bit. Unfortunately, ice climbing is suffering in many ways. And so that kind of played to my strengths in that way. I could put in the work even if I don't have the natural balance and agility and strength that other people might bring to the sport. The movement itself clicked and made sense, and I was hooked. From that first, I did 3 days of guided training essentially. And from there, I was like, yep, this is what I do now. For better, for worse, this is it.
Would you say that ice climbing is suffering, particularly in New England?
Oh man, ice climbing in New England is suffering in so many ways. I mean, you get the extreme cold, but also you get the extreme warm and everything disappears. So, you're a weekend warrior and it's great weather, great weather, great weather. And then it just rains or everything's falling down, et cetera. And while that can be a good thing in the long run, things rebuild and reform, you only have a limited window. You really need to be able to take advantage of it. And there's so many times where you're like, oh, that'll be in. And then some weather event happens. That plus it doesn't get as cold as other places, but it's also incredibly damp and moist. And so that cold is particularly biting. There's a lot of other people out there too. Sometimes you're waiting around, you're fighting to get on things. You got to get up early. The clocks changing are not your friend ever in ice season. It just means you have to get up that much earlier and be willing to do the approach in the dark or be the first one there. So yeah, there's so many aspects of the sport that just get you out of your comfort zone. And I think that's one of the cool things about it.
You've been at it for almost 20 years. So do you mind just talking maybe a little bit about your progression? And you emphasize that you like thin technical ice and scrappy mixed especially. So I'm just
Yeah.
curious of all the potential ice you could climb, why those are your favorites.
Sure. So yeah, I started the winter of 05, 06. And I think that my progression, I probably started leading too early, like everybody, because I was antsy and wanted to go climb and wanted to climb bigger things. But at the same time, in terms of like progressing the grades, I definitely wasn't climbing water ice 5 until 6, 7 years into that.
Which seems reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, I averaged, of course, across my like climbing career, probably 35 days on ice or on the tools a winter. So like basically every weekend, December into the beginning of March, and with some longer stints thrown in there. Um, the reality is like I was pretty slow in progressing out of like water ice 4 because it just gets longer stretches of steep ice. It's more physical, it really requires more technique. And I would say that my progression on that in terms of climbing harder ice and steeper ice was not just a like smooth linear progression. It's very much it's like the stock market. It's up and down, it's up and down, it's up, it's down. But over time, the overall trend line goes up. There'd be days I go out, I might climb a water ice 5, and then the next day I'm like too fried mentally to even get up a 4. Like the first time I led repentance on Cathedral, so like water ice 5, M4, 5-ish, a big deal for me. The next day I couldn't get up a 4 minus at, Frankenstein. I was just like, nope, I'm fried. This is too hard. I can't like get my mind around it. Because I had to dig so deep. So, right, just because you've done one thing once doesn't mean that becomes your new norm and your new baseline. So the progression for me has very much been that undulating up and down, but with a general trend line going up over the years. Yeah, as for the thin, techie, and scrappy mixed, I think part of that is playing to my strengths as a climber aren't necessarily the classic physical gifts, but rather they play to my mental strength, my ability to be patient and really figure things out, work things out, work the footwork, figure out ways to balance. I think those are all things that are rewarded in that style of climbing versus, you get a water ice 5+ or 6, and it's just a huge sheet of ice and just, you can wail away at things. If you're physically strong, you can do it. If you're technically proficient, you can do it. For me, like now, I could do it because of both. And enjoy it more. But that thin techie stuff really requires you to be dialed and thoughtful. And the same I think is true of like kind of scrappy, on your feet, insecure alpine mix climbing. It's not necessarily, can I just hold on? It's, can I keep it together? And that to me is really, I think, the most interesting form of climbing is the mental challenge of it as much as the physical side of things.
In terms of progression into leading, what would you suggest for other people?
My progression into leading was like, well, I wanted to do it, and so I did it. But I think for, if you want to be really smart about progressing into leading ice, you really need to not just top rope a lot of ice, but I think follow a lot of ice. So you understand the stances of taking out screws and thus putting in screws. You get to see the decision-making of the leader in terms of where they place screws. So hopefully you're working with somebody who really knows what they're doing and is thoughtful about that, because you can follow somebody up something and they place a screw every 3 feet because they're gripped and they're not in good stances. That doesn't necessarily help you in terms of the decision-making if you don't have the body of work to understand, like, they were in over their head and this is how I would do it. That just becomes the norm if that person is your mentor or is somebody that you're looking up to. So I think following ice is in some ways even more valuable than top roping. Top roping is great because you can get a lot of volume in. And I think the movement mechanics are a huge piece of what you need to dial in and work on. If you want to lead ice, you need to spend time figuring out how to stand in your feet and how not to be just death gripping your tool and being in inefficient positions such that you're wasting energy. Because if you think about it, you're up there, you're in an inefficient position, you're wasting energy, you're already scared because you're a newer leader, you're fumbling with the screw, you're really cold, your gloves are too big, so you're over gripping everything. You can't really feel anything. It's not stacked in your favor. And you might be fine, you might get through it, but are you going to enjoy the experience? Now, it doesn't have to be fun to be fun. Will you enjoy the experience after having done it? Hopefully. But for some people, that answer is no. I have friends who do not like leading ice. They like ice climbing. They don't like leading ice. And then, are you going to take something away from that experience in terms of understanding the skill better, as opposed to just, I was scared? And it's okay to be scared. Like, I get scared all the freaking time. The reality is, if the only takeaway though is that you were scared, it wasn't a really good learning experience. So I think for those who are looking to get into leading ice, get really proficient in your movement, at least through Water Ice 4, and follow things that are 4 and up, because you're not going to start leading on Water Ice 4 most likely. But if you know you have the physical skills and the physical ability to hang on and move in that terrain and remove screws in that terrain, hopefully that'll help you relax a little bit and be like, okay, I have a reservoir of strength and ability that I could call on so I can work through this and practice this new skill set, placing screws, clipping, managing where I'm placing gear, etc. The other thing I will throw out there for people is lower angle is not always easier or safer.
It's hard to kick in lower angle
It's
stuff.
hard to kick in, and you have to clear bulges. And oftentimes the scariest part of any lead I do, even up through Water Ice 6, is like the bulge at the top when there's a lot of rope out and I have to like work around some weird things, and I have to get my foot up at my tool basically and make sure that I'm not, ripping that tool out. If you're going to start leading, be really thoughtful about the terrain you're going to lead on, and don't just look at the number. Look at what the movement mechanics are going to be for that pitch and assess whether you have those skills or not, right? And if you're comfortable in that terrain or not, because grades in climbing in general are subjective. Grades in ice climbing are like pretty much totally made up. And give you a plus or minus 1 to 1.5 in terms of the difficulty, and don't actually speak to the skill set you're going to need on a given pitch. Water Ice 5, it could be, this really big, steep curtain of ice that you can stem all the way up, or it could be a slightly shorter curtain that you have to like climb the outside of a pillar, like on drop line, where all of a sudden you're like, this is really hard. It's only like 25 feet of steep climbing, but Jesus, my arms are like blasted from this because you can't find those little rests all the time. Whereas you go climb something at Willoughby that's much longer, and you like Glass Menagerie potentially, and you can stem a groove the entire way. And while it's steep and long, you can rest. So really understanding that the number is meaningless, it gives some sense of difficulty, but doesn't speak to the skill set that you're going to need on any given pitch.
So I actually started leading last year, and it was my second season, and I'd probably been on ice for, let's say, 60 plus days by that point. And I started on WI3 stuff and just really kind of eased into it. But what I found, just as far as like feeling comfortable on it, was how much you can actually just hang on your pinky. And I knew if I had good feet and I could hang off my pinky, I could just hang there all day,
Mm-hmm.
And that really forced me to evaluate how is my body positioning, almost at every stage, because I could feel myself gripping, and then I would relax and be like, oh, okay, yeah, this feels okay. Yeah. And if not, then I'd have to readjust.
Right. And just adjusting your feet, getting them even or getting them centered around your tool goes so far, no matter how steep it is. If you have those opportunities, it makes a huge difference. Now, you don't always have those opportunities, especially in more difficult terrain. But if you can, yeah, you don't need to squeeze your tool. You just have to hook on it with your hand most of the time and relax your hand. And like you said, if you can find that structure where you just rest onto the pinky, you can hang on for a really long time.
You did say something that really caught my attention. I've experienced it more recently, which is you have this jagged approach. Like the linear progression is generally up and to the right. If you average it out, you have these ups
Yep.
and downs. And sometimes you do a climb where it's just stressful the entire time. And it might be physically pushing you, but you're not at your limit. But it's just the combination of the two that really seems, at least for me, I need like a week or more to recharge sometimes. Like I'll go out climbing and be like, I just don't have it in me.
Yep.
And I'm wondering, where do you think that comes from? And it seems particularly acute in ice climbing.
Really what it is the mental toll. So you do something that is one of those peaks, right? You can think of it as like you're leveling up in many ways. You're pushing yourself physically, you're pushing yourself mentally. And one of the things that we work on in Project Direct is accessing flow. Most people think of flow as just kind of like you black out and like everything goes perfectly. But the reality is flow as a mental state is just a series of good decisions. Now, one of the stages of flow, however, that people don't realize is that there's a recovery period, right? In order to make a sustained series of decisions that are high quality, and in this case, with ice climbing, potentially high consequence, you're exercising your brain. Well, if you exercise your muscles, what do you need after that? You need a rest. Your brain needs a rest when it pushes so hard and so far beyond what its normal capacity, or at least its normal output might be. So when you do something like that, like you push and you have a lead that's like the lead of a lifetime, yeah, it might take a week or two in order to recover and be able to operate even at like a basic level. That's what happened to me when I first did repentance. That was a big step up for me. It was a climb that I backed off of a few times, that had been in my mind for years. And I did it and it was great. And then the next day, like I backed off of Smear and Bob's Delight at Frankenstein. Both are like 4 minus and we're in totally fine shape. I just like mentally was not tuned in because I needed the recovery, the rest. And I was out that day because that's what I do is like I go out, right? I go out and climb. I didn't need to. I probably would have been better off not, not climbing at all. I've also had experiences where I went on a Canadian Rockies trip and I was by far the strongest of the three of us. We had pretty limited terrain because of the Abbey hazard. So I was pushing myself on things that were water ice 5 and up for me. And this was 2012, 2013. So like those grades were hard for me. And I was not able to every day kind of climb at my peak and climb well because I just needed the recovery and I wasn't getting it. Fast forward 5 or 6 years, I went out for another week in the Canadian Rockies. And I think every day for 6 straight days was climbing water ice 5 to water ice 6 because that threshold, that base level for me had come up. That was, really telling that you can train your mind, you can train your brain to bring up that base level so that those harder routes are no longer these anomalous peaks, but are more within kind of the range of that trend line where your body doesn't need to tap in quite so much.
Were there particular things that progressed from that first Canadian trip to that second Canadian trip for you?
There are a lot of factors, I think, that play into that. A big one that I think people don't really focus on or that we don't want to focus on has to do with ego. So the first trip, I felt like I really needed to prove myself. I was climbing with somebody who had been a mentor to me for years, but that I was climbing harder than. I was climbing with somebody who I had been mentoring, and physically as an athlete, like has all the gifts that I don't, but didn't have the experience. So I felt like I was in this sweet spot where I needed to perform. and like I'd be letting people down if I didn't. And I think for myself, like I wanted to be that guy who could do these things. The reality of it is, I was that guy who could do those things, just not day in, day out. By the time I got to that second trip, I think I'd accepted a bit more that maybe I do it, maybe I don't. It doesn't really matter. We're just ice climbing. I'm out with a friend, somebody who values me for who I am and not, for my climbing ability. Now, was he psyched when I tagged on to the trip? Absolutely, because he knew I would climb all the things that he wasn't going to lead. But there was never any pressure to do that. And I think a big part of that is not that the previous trip that there was external pressure, there was internal pressure that I was putting on myself to prove myself. Whereas that later trip, I realized I don't need to prove myself every day. At times, sure, it's fun to feed the ego. Nobody is going to be without ego. It's just a matter of kind of keeping it in check and understanding how it plays into our decision making. And so by that time, it was less important to me to feed that ego. And thus I felt more relaxed getting on harder things.
So you were a teacher and now you're not a teacher. Now you're a coach. So I'm just curious, how did you get into coaching?
Yeah, I was a high school history teacher for 12 years. I've always taught in independent schools. So a part of that often includes coaching. Through high school, I played hockey, I played lacrosse, played JV football, spent 1 year on varsity and got mono before the first game. So that was a short-lived career, probably for the best. I am not a big person. And I was on a team with a kid who went on to play in the NFL. So I've always kind of had this like misguided notion of what athletes are from that. And it's like, well, that's them, right? But I think for me, coaching is another form of teaching. It's another outlet for connecting with another person and sharing in experiences and helping them to find their potential and their own understanding. And then at the end of 2018, I needed a break. And so I took a year off to travel and climb. And then coming out of that year, wasn't finding a teaching job. Started working at Central Rock Gym in Stoneham, right here where I live, coaching in the non-competitive program. And that kind of evolved into coaching the competition program, running the non-competitive program, running the adult program. And then Carly, who owns and runs Project Direct, when she first started, she reached out to me as a potential athlete. She and I had climbed together intensely on that year in which I was traveling climbing. And so I saw that as a great investment kind of in myself, in my own climbing and in, my own pursuit in coaching. So for me, the coaching is a continuation. Like I'm not a teacher in terms of occupation, but I see myself as an educator.
It sounds like the past few years you've been focusing more on sport climbing than maybe ever before. Was that aligned with your sabbatical year?
So that was very much aligned with that sabbatical year. Friend and I tried the Grand Traverse in the Tetons, but pretty late in the season, like after there'd been some significant snow and freezing and thawing. And so we epicked for sure. We were finding issues, icy cracks, and then I ripped off a block the size of, a small dresser and took that for a ride, watching it chase me down as I fall, thinking this is it. It flew past me. I was around a couple corners, so JP was safe, but I fell upside down. I thought I'd broken my back. We're 1.5 pitches from the top of the Grand on the north side. And we needed to finish it up. Brought JP up, sent him up, and then he's trying to find a way to avoid ice to get to the top. And I ended up saying, like, look, there's ice. I have crampons, aluminum crampons, a super lightweight axe. And it's like, I can get us to the top despite, legitimately thinking like my back might be broken. And so make it happen, get to the top. We're wrapping down, and we met Valerie Anderson, who owns the 10 Sleep Rock Ranch. They were descending, and she mentioned she owned that. And I turned to my friend and like, no, it sounds really good right now. Sport climbing. Up to that point, I'd never invested in sport climbing at all. It kind of sparked a bit of a shift because that experience on the Grand Traverse, learned a lot from it, but it was not type 1 or type 2 fun in that moment. And so started to understand in 10 Sleep, like, oh, sport climbing is really fun. It's a really great way to be able to focus on movement it can be a stressful situation, but in a very different type of stress. Most of the stress is, you're putting on yourself versus the outward environment. And so that kind of pushed me more towards sport climbing over the last several years. But what I'm finding is that it ebbs and flows. I came into this year thinking I really wanted to focus on pushing my sport climbing, but then I had a finger injury and then I had a back injury. And so I'm coming into this fall basically detrained and really feeling like I want to get back on gear roots. And what I'm finding is like I identify as a rock climber, I identify as a climber. And that includes, for me to feel fulfilled and happy, it includes both trad climbing and sport climbing.
What would the transition period look like for you going into ice season? And how are you training before? And has your training changed at all in the past few years now that you're focusing more on hard sport?
Over the last several years, really for me, like the start of my season is when something's climbable on tandem, or I'll start getting on the tools, dry tooling. So that like shift to sport climbing has kind of opened my eyes in terms of physical training for bigger, harder moves than maybe what I would have done in the past. In the past, maybe I'd spend a lot more time doing things that are going to help with the endurance side of things, like calf endurance, swing endurance. I don't really do that much anymore. Like my calves are strong enough, I could climb whatever I want. My forearms are generally strong enough, I could climb whatever I want. But like working some of the big muscle stuff, things like walk-offs, pulls, weighted pulls have definitely changed. I'm doing a lot more in terms of like scapular work to protect my shoulders, especially in harder mixed climbing. If your feet are going to blow in a mixed route or an ice route, can you sustain that shock loading of the shoulder and then pull through that to re-engage and get your feet back on. So really looking at a lot more of the big muscle type stuff with my training versus kind of things that you would see as being more sports specific. With like, can I do like hammer swings forever? Or like, can I do calf raises forever? You get to a certain point, like, for me, a lot of people need a ramping up in ice season to get to their performance phase. I don't. Like, I'm not going to climb my hardest thing right off the couch, but I'm going to climb things off the couch that most people think of as hard routes. And a lot of that is mental. I've just spent so much time on those types of routes and that type of terrain. So I put in the investment in the long term. And part of that speaks to, we were talking about that kind of like things just kind of click for me. The movement on ice, it takes me like one swing of the tool to be like, oh yeah, this feels right. This is natural to me. In a way that rock climbing for me does not.
I'm the opposite. I find dry tooling way more intuitive because for me, it's like super bouldering.
Yep.
And it's just like you have extensions of your arms. You can do egregious drop knees. It's a lot of core.
Yeah.
It's fairly dynamic. And ice to me, the traditional 3-point stance, it just seems like so robotic after a while. And I understand that it works. That's why I like mixed climbing quite a bit, because you really start to blend all those disciplines.
Yeah. Yeah. And you definitely do. And actually the coolest thing about like hard ice is like, it's not that robotic, because when you look at a big steep piece of ice, you're like, oh, that's a big column of ice. And then when you get up close, you realize it's not a column of ice at all. It's a whole bunch of like weird congealed fins and lattice work. And you can't just get into that traditional stance. And you're doing things like drop knees and hooking, whether it's your heel hooking around something or draping the back swept points of your forefoot. All of that stuff is where ice climbing, I think, really shines and really gets interesting versus you get that like big, smooth kind of, yeah, it can be robotic in some ways, but also there's something to be said for being super efficient in that terrain and climbing it really fast. One swing's just bump your hand to the upper grip, hike your feet up high and repeat. The next thing you know, it's been like 30 seconds and you're like 30 feet up or you're like, oh, I better place a screw. But yeah, the higher end ice, when ice gets weird, that's where all those like movement skills that come with rock climbing and mixed climbing play out on ice as well. Just with like an added element of maybe you have to be delicate in some ways. I don't want to break these like hangers and features off, but you want to use them. And there's all kinds of weird trickery then you're pulling out of that toolkit to figure out.
Going back to what you said before, when you're gripped and it gives you that sort of acute, narrow focus on the terrain, and you might not be exploring the full options of what you have in front of you. You're not noticing the fins or the divots
Yeah.
or the bulges or what have you. Um, I want to see if maybe we can dive into that a little bit more with your climb of Call of the Wild, because you wrote an article where you talked a lot about your mental training leading into that. So, can you just talk about what Call of the Wild is and
Yep.
what happened on that route?
Yeah, absolutely. So, to set the stage, like Call of the Wild is at Lake Willoughby in Vermont. It's in the Mindbender Amphitheater. And so it's a variation of the route Mindbender. Mindbender itself is a 2-pitch water ice 5+. You can link the bulk of it into like 1 mega 5+ pitch. And what it does is you kind of go up the left side and then you have to step around off of the main flow and then pull around onto a hanging curtain of ice and finish up that hanger. It's a route that I think it might have been the first thing in New England to get like that NEI 6th grade. And NEI grades and water ice grades, we could have a whole nother podcast on that. But it's a water ice. What makes it a water ice 6 is the fact that it is pulling onto a free hanging curtain of ice. So you can't just like plug screws wherever you want, because you don't want to plug screws into the hanging portion because if you shear it off, you're going with it. And so the mental training that I was doing that year, I was working with Carly and was really working on accessing flow, accessing the flow state and working on techniques to allow me to remain focused and make good decisions. So my mind would wander, developing techniques of like using my breathing, using some mantras to help me refocus on what was important and what I needed to do in the moment, not what could happen up there or what was happening back home or any of that stuff, but really to bring myself back to just being in the moment. And so on this climb, I was with Holden Pellet, and he led up the first. I guess I don't remember if we did it in 2 or 3 pitches total, but he led up to below the crux, and so he's belaying off to the side of the right. And so for me, what I needed to do was kind of traverse some like sub blobs of ice that are tucked under the roof, and then find a way to transition onto the hanger. So I had to, and it was not necessarily the hardest climbing to get over, but it felt pumpy because all the ice was a bit bulged out. So you're shattering dinner plates constantly. You're kind of like just super exposed. You're hanging your ass out into space like over nothing. And you have some hangers above you. You need to make sure you don't swing into or hit with your foot or your head, depending on where you are. And so to access the main hanger, I mean, I could have just traversed low around and come up. I hate traversing. So if I can avoid that, I will. And so between this little sub hanger that you're trying not to kick off and the main hanger, essentially the 2 hangers form a chimney. And that chimney was just packed with flutings and crappy ice. Really delicate, really like a lattice work of ice. And so I got screws below in the, the bulgy good ice. And then I was working up into that chimney very delicately. And then I was not delicate enough and basically unloaded like 400 pounds of ice, of all that ice, onto myself. Right. I like basically broke it all off and it all came crashing down on top of me. I had one good tool. I was able to like hang on, be okay. But I got hit hard. And I have a pretty extensive history with concussions. I've knocked myself out in a climbing accident, and I've had a number of other concussions. So I'm pretty conservative if I take a blow to the head. And so I was like, whoa, I just got hit hard. I went down to my last good screw and just clipped in direct, like took the helmet off to make sure I hadn't broken it, because that's a good sign. Like if I had cracked the helmet, that's a good sign that something's wrong. It was fine. It was good. Alden was talking to me. He's like, what do you want to do? Like, no worries, man. Like, and he even said at one point, he's like, I know I would back off if that just happened to me. And I was like, okay, like I now have like somebody who's been climbing forever and climbed all the hard routes in New England and beyond. Expressing like, yeah, that was real. Right. Okay, cool. I have some like validation of that experience. But at the same time, I recognize that one, I'm okay. Right. Bringing my breathing back, focusing on, okay, well, that's happened in the past. I'm fine. And looking up, well, the beauty of it now is there's not, 400 pounds of crappy ice in my way. Right. I can now like swing into the good ice and the main curtain and work my way up if I want. There's nothing in the way. And really, it's like thinking about flow as like decision making and using tools, focusing on my breathing, really. And, a mantra that I like to use, and I like to remind myself is like, don't turn around until there's a reason. At that point, I'm physically fine. I've got plenty of gear. The terrain ahead looks accessible and doable. There's not a reason to turn around. I mean, maybe I get up there and I will find a reason to turn around, but there isn't one in that moment. Past me at various points probably would have been like, yep, that was a bad idea. Let's get out of here. But the reality of it is, in that moment at that time, it's like, okay, well, there's no real reason to turn around just because something unexpected or scary happened. And so as a result, I was like, well, I might as well go up and see what I see. And so now I could like wedge myself in between those columns and ended up, coming up around the back side of it and able to get a good screw in like ice behind the attachment and, turn that column. Had a really sweet, there's like a little blob right on the arete of the column that like, I end up putting one foot on and like perching on essentially, like not no hands, but like you feel like this exposed hero, like standing there like a gargoyle. And then it's like, okay, cool. Then you look ahead, you're like, I could do that. And then turn the corner. And by like going up that chimney and turning the corner, I mean, turning onto a hanging piece of ice might be the coolest thing in climbing, in terms of movement or exposure. And then it's just dead vertical steep ice for about 20 feet to the top out. And the top out is always exciting, especially in that amphitheater. There's something about the way the ice adheres to the rock. And then there's like always mud above it. So I was able to get a screw to protect the top out. If there's one piece of advice I would give to everybody who ice climbs is place a damn screw at the top. I don't care how easy it is. I don't care what the terrain is or how confident you are or how hard it was below compared to up there. I've had friends break vertebrae in falls on easy terrain because they didn't place a screw at the top.
Rule like number 3 that I learned was protect your exit.
Protect the exit always. And so because like the exit up there is into like semi-frozen mud and sticks and like there's, yeah. So like protect the exit, be really delicate at getting out. But, um, without the focus on mental training and thinking about decision making, thinking about bringing back my focus, there's no way that I decide to continue up after really just like eating shit from like 400 pounds of ice. Like I got walloped. And it was my own doing. I hit the thing. I tried to climb it in that way. I should have just like gone up and just like reached around and like cleared it all out first. Um, but it was cool. And I think one of the great things about that experience, nobody had climbed it that season. A couple years before that, I had come in and Alden called it Call of the Mild because the hanger fully attached. So it's just like a step around move that you could protect. Like this was not that; it was hanging. But the unknown of it all, I think, was really cool. And that's one of the things about ice climbing is like conditions are always changing. The experience is always different. Um, and doing something that hasn't been done yet that season, or like going up to something that is an unknown and seeing if you have the skills mentally, physically, technically to do it, it is just such a great learning experience and opportunity every time you go out.
So you're saying now that you would have reevaluated maybe how you approached the chimney portion with the junky lattice work of
Yeah.
ice. Did you just, I guess, where was your head at that point that you decided sort of like climb up into it? And what happened when it actually unloaded on you? You swung a little bit too hard and lost focus, or
Yeah.
you were just
Yeah.
feeling good, or
So I was looking up and like looking at that lattice work in there, and it's like that's climbable. I can use it. I can hook on things, etc. Um, to try and work through it. A big part of climbing and like free hanging ice, that free hanging ice environment is cleaning things out to make things suitable, especially on like mixed climbs that gain curtains and stuff. I think coming from my background of being more like trend climbing, alpine climbing, my mindset was very much, and you work with what's in front of you. And sometimes you forget, like you can change what's in front of you. You can clear shit out, break stuff off. And I think it's a good thing to remember that. But I think there's a balance to be played there of, okay, but can I do it in its form? Right. And it's that mental challenge. It's a personal challenge in that. And so I was working up all that kind of weird lattice work ice and a little bit with the tool in the hanger on the left, trying to avoid the one on the right, especially down low, so I didn't snap it off. And at some point in that hooking, like I had to like swing into it and, I'm tapping, and then a little too hard. And it just, it was reaching way high. And so it just snapped off above the tool and just kind of all came crashing down, like right on my head, shoulders, etc.
did you focus specifically on mental training leading up to that climb? I guess like where did you start leading WI6, and was were you proactive about mental training to get into that grade? Because at least in the article you talk about sort of some of the tactics that you used, the mantras and the staying present and the noticing. Was that something that you found was like a limiting factor, or something that you felt like you could really benefit from?
That second Canadian Rockies trip I mentioned, I climbed Pilsner Pillar, which is a classic water ice 6. And I think that's probably the first thing I climbed that at least got that, like the guidebook grade. And that kind of opened my eyes a little bit into like what I can do. But I didn't necessarily approach the mental training thinking I needed that to unlock, climbing harder ice. But it definitely felt like these were tools and tactics that would help me tap into that more regularly to be able to access styles of terrain I'd climbed before, but maybe it felt like it was one of those spikes on that graph rather than, in kind of the trend line. So yeah, I didn't necessarily like think of, I'm going to use this training to be able to climb Call of the Wild, right? I mean, the thing about some of these hard ice routes is like you can't really plan to do them until they come in because they just might not be there. People are often asking me, what are your ice goals for this? And it's like, I don't know what's going to be in it, what's going to exist. There's plenty of routes out there I'd love to climb, but if they're not in, it doesn't matter. And I have to, reassess and change my goals accordingly. At this point, on any day out on ice and mix, like I want to learn something. That's kind of my barometer on whether it's worth going or not. And so that might be that I solo something that's easy because I feel like soloing, like you're always learning something because you have to be present. I don't solo very much. And I only solo basically like the Alpine gullies at this point. I don't like soloing all that much. I've gone out to go solo Dracula and just been like, yeah, screw this. This seat's dumb. I think I climb best when I'm placing gear. I can relax knowing there is a system in place and I climb faster, I climb better. One of my regular partners, he's soloed the dike countless times. He's soloed Water Ice 5 countless times. Holden Pellet, is kind of a master free soloist in steep ice. That's not me. I've soloed up to Water Ice 4. But the time I've done that, to be honest, I was kind of in a dark place in terms of what was going on in my life. And I realized that was a dumb decision. I didn't need to do that. There's no point. I didn't enjoy it either.
Well, at this point, 20 years in, and I know that ice climbing has longevity and it also doesn't have longevity, but people are, climbing ice into their 70s. So for you, where you're at, what do you think you still have to learn, or what is getting you, most excited to try? We could, if you want, we could talk about your first free ascent with John Nicolotti of the Resistance, if you want.
There's always something to learn. That's the cool thing about ice. It's always different, and presents different challenges. But I think part of why I'm starting to get more into mixed climbing is it offers up a whole different set of challenges. Climbing with John, both on the Resistance on Mount Washington and also across the Great Divide on Canyon, basically, I think might have been a week apart or 2 weeks apart. Were really eye-opening experiences for me to be able to climb with somebody who's very much like a master of that craft. I think John and I have become have a good partnership in the winter because, John can climb ice. He could climb up to Water Ice 6, no problem. As he once said, describing to somebody, he's like, yeah, I've climbed that, but I don't feel comfortable or natural in that. Pat's a natural ice climber. He's kind of mastered the ice side of things. He feels more comfortable on the mixed side of things. And so being able to go up into terrain that would be a reach for me and allow me to follow some of these really hard and to me scary pitches, it was a unique opportunity. So the Resistance on Mount Washington, I led the ice on that, the first pinch of Pinnacle Gully. John said to me, he's like, are you game to lead the first pinch of ice? I'm not big on soloing. And I'm like, cool, I'm not either. I'll play screws. And it was great. I think we complement each other there. And then it's having 7 or 7+ torque crack through a mantle. And then it's what we ended up grading M10. It's a 40-degree overhung wall for 20 feet through an off with.
I can read what Zach St. Jules wrote here. This was quoting you, and then he's describing the climb. So as a belayer, I can tell he's unsure or nervous, but he works through it, and he works through it methodically. While belaying the crux pitch of the Resistance, a 35-degree overhang split by an off-width crack, Cooke recalls holding his breath. Nicolotti was on lead, hanging from a ratty, torqued tool head with almost non-existent footholds. He matched on the tool, moved carefully, controlled his breathing, placed a piece, and then moved into a slippery, insecure knee lock and did it all over again. He was hanging out on the steepest train there on a tool he's very much worried is going to rip out, and he's both calm enough to stay focused and has the physical strength to hang on, find those rests, and move through. He really showed his mastery of the craft in that terrain.
I mean, that's, like he is a master of his craft. And the piece that stands out to me that I didn't write in there is like he was unsure. He was scared, right? At the same time, he's got his tool torqued in this like BD 3/4 crack. And he's like yelling at it, like, stay, don't blow, stay. Like he thinks it's going to blow. He thinks it's going to rip, but he's not backing off. He's not taking on a piece. He's progressing upward, right? And the same is true, in hard ice climbing, mixed climbing. Like when you're really skilled at it, it's not that it's a sure thing. It's still in doubt. And it's the terrain where things are in doubt that I find really inspiring, because that's where you learn the most. There's the possibility of success, and there's also the possibility of failure. And really gauging whether that risk of failure is worth proceeding and in trying is really the alchemy of the sport, right? There's no right answer. Once you get into, especially hard ice, like maybe on mixed terrain, you can have good gear, you can risk falls, whether if it's bolted or even if it's traditional gear. But on ice, I have never fallen on an ice screw, knock on wood. I have caught people who have fallen on ice screws. I've seen lots of people who have fallen on ice screws. They work. I don't want to test it. You have to decide, everyone has to decide for themselves whether the reward is worth it. Working with John on that, on the resistance, and seeing that at such a hard physical level, and it was mentally taxing, but probably was not as mentally taxing as what we'd done on Across the Great Divide on Canyon the week or so before, because there at least was good gear. John had freed the first couple pitches, fixed a rope, and then I came with him on day 2, jugged up so he could work on the crux pitch to the top. And he sent the crux pitch, which is M8 on like real small gear. And then that next pitch was M6 plus R. And he didn't free it, but got to the top, came down. He had also dropped all of our iron, all of our pound in pro. At that point, I mean, he had what he needed placed into that pitch. So that was a good thing, but that's not a great headspace to be in, being like, well, there goes, half, maybe not half my usable rack, but a quarter of my usable rack, and something that's very helpful in that type of terrain. Mm. And he felt like he, wasn't going to do it. And what I said to him, he was like, well, he said, what do you think? I said, like, well, there's no reason to turn around. And he's like, well, yeah, I'm just tired. It's like, yeah, but you made it to the top, you know what to do. And I think the thing I'm most proud of in that ascent is that, like John told me, that I was the right partner for that day, because I was able to put into perspective that there's not a reason to turn around. Yeah, it's hard. We're doing this because it's hard, but you're capable of doing it. And we have the daylight. We have enough gear. We're going to be fine. Might as well give it a try. We've already shown that you could go up and not send and be okay. Let's see if we could go up and send. And he did. It's not the hardest pitch physically on that route, but mentally, it's the one that has the worst gear and like the potential for the worst fall as a result. And so he brought me up, and then I took it to the top through the Whitney Gilman to top out. And then we had a bit of a mini epic rappelling, because rappelling that face is not fun. We had gear down at the base, and we had a few $100s worth of pitons just laying in the snow. And but the getting into that type of terrain for me was eye-opening and I recognized and realized that that's terrain I can access myself that I probably never would have if I hadn't had the opportunity to work with a mentor and to really see how it can be done effectively.
What's interesting is that so climbing with John, who's a mentor, but also like a peer, and you're similar ages, right?
I'm actually a good bit older than him.
Okay.
He's 30. I turn 40 next week.
So mentors can come in all shapes. You have different strengths. You complement each other quite well, and his strength actually is in part his physical strength. And
Mhm.
it seems like that may be a bit eye opening for you and how you might start thinking about training and climbs that you think that are available to you. One thing that you've noted in the past is that you're seeing actually quite a few very strong rock climbers sort of transitioning into ice climbing. But you've also said that they're in places where they really have no business being, and I just what you mean by that?
I'm definitely seeing more and more people who are climbing harder ice routes. Um, but what I'm seeing also is that there are a lot of these people, not all of them by any means. There are so many talented ice climbers out there who you don't even know about, right? They're under the radar. They've gone through and really perfected their craft. But also, you see people who are incredibly strong physically, and thus they're climbing water ice 5, and maybe they get up and they're fine, but they don't really understand the ice, the mechanics of it, the way to evaluate. They're getting on stuff where I would be like, there's no way in hell I would touch that in these conditions, right? And then in this weather, um, or in just pieces like that. And because what I'm seeing is because people are physically stronger, they can hold on to their tools. So as long as they can get their tools into the ice, they're going to make it to the top. Now they might be just bashing away, you kind of, destroying it, but if they're going to progress in the sport, there's a whole host of techniques and like the evaluation of conditions and terrain and understanding that's largely missing. And that I think that there's the possibility for that like catastrophic failure in a way that doesn't exist necessarily in trad climbing and definitely sport climbing, right? Where the strength will get you into a trap of okay, I can get up this physically, it seems. I can stop and throw in a screw here and there because I'm physically strong, but the screw is in total garbage, right? It's what might actually be unprotectable terrain or terrain where you really need to get creative to protect. You need to dig out through the bobbles to get to real ice, instead of just placing it's like just placing in the surface. Like, okay, cool. You like just put that into like grandma's crochet project there, and it's just going to shatter as soon as you weight it. And like recognizing pieces like that, I think that's where if you're a strong, physically strong climber, you want to be careful to understand like, am I getting up things because I'm physically strong? Or am I getting up things because I can climb well and protect it well? And the answer to that second question, I think, is where I see things being pretty iffy. Um, when people are coming out of being strong rock climbers and like, oh, cool, I can hang on to jugs. It's like, yeah, as long as you bury the picks into the ice, you can hang on. But you're going to run into terrain where you can't, right? You're going to run into that like crappy lattice work that I did on Call of the Wild. All of a sudden, you can't swing, or you're going to get into where if you swing hard, it's just going to bounce out a rock behind it, or it's going to shatter it. So there's no ice there anymore. And things like that. And so I would just caution people to invest in the understanding of the medium, even if that means we need to check our ego a little, right? And we need to just say, I am unsure about this. maybe I test the waters a little bit. I start up, be willing to back off. And I've climbed so many amazing routes throughout the Northeast, including some real rare ones and hard ones. But my alter ego on the internet is le poser, right? Kind of faking it until you make it. And Silas Rossi at one point is like, you're climbing so well and hard enough. I think you need to retire that. And I was like, no, because that like keeps me in check. Because you never feel like you never feel like you're the elite, you're in that top tier. One, it keeps you hungry, and two, maybe it keeps you a little realistic to what's going on. I've climbed amazing things because I'm patient and willing to wait for the right conditions, even if that means I'm passing on climbing things when they might be climbable for me. But as you said, like you've climbed in this sport and into your 70s. Tommy Yandon's climbing Water Ice 6, and he is, older than the earth itself. I want to be Tommy, I don't need to climb it now. I want to climb it when it feels right, and when I'm climbing it, not in the sense of I'm getting away with something, but rather things are coming together and I'm doing it in a way that I could be proud of the fact that I did it versus like, oh, I maybe shouldn't have done. And I think that's a good lesson for people who are trying to break into the upper end of the sport is like approach it with that one, a learner's mindset and an eye towards longevity. I think that really what's lacking for most climbers is meaningful mentorship and an understanding that there's a lot to learn that is not the physical, but is really in the evaluating of conditions, the mental side of things as well. I think that's where if you can find somebody and find good people to get information from, I think that's really important. Instagram's great for posting conditions photos, but the conditions photos, 90% of the conditions photos out there are like, hey, this is it. Or like, I climbed this. It's like, okay, well, who posted it? Like, I've fallen into this trap. It's like, oh, dude, what is it? Way in the Wilderness. It looks great. I climbed the other day, walked up to it. I was just like, what the fuck? It turns out the person who led it was Kevin Mahoney. Like, I'm a good ice climber. I'm not Kevin Mahoney. Like, that guy's a ninja, So like understanding who posts things, what their risk tolerance is, what their skill level is, right? Because a photo of an ice climb, it shows that it's there, but it doesn't really speak to what the experience was and what the condition actually is. I posted a photo of the first pitch called on account of rains, and people are like, oh my God, it's fat. It's like, actually, well, that's a bottomed out 10, that's a bottomed out 10, that's a bottomed out 10. And that whole section is hollow and feels like it's going to fall. So like really being thoughtful about where you get information from and looking for information and understanding what the source of that information is, because you might have a mentor who's very cautious. You might have a mentor who is very like gung ho and pushes you, and recognizing what their tendencies are. If you want to be at this for a long time, you need to figure out what you need and where you can get the appropriate information to make the decision for yourself. Because this is a sport where really the only person who can make the decision of go, no go is you. I've started off things countless times. I've bailed off of more hard things than I've sent, and that's important to keep in mind.
I have one last question for you that sort of goes along the lines of mentorship. If you were to give your younger self, one piece of beta, what would that be? Could be climbing or otherwise.
I think for me, this is definitely climbing related. I think I would allow myself to maybe have, and this flies totally in the face of what I just talked about, which is kind of hilarious.
Oh, good.
I think I maybe was overly conservative at times early on in terms of what I was capable. And so allow myself to have, like, I like to describe it as like having big eyes. I like climbing with partners who are like, "Ooh, we could do this." Because I'm often like, no, like there's this. Sometimes I like, it's helpful to have that push, but having somebody like, if I were at my younger self, if I allowed myself at times to maybe have a bigger lens of what was possible, would have been helpful to me. As long as I continued to pair it with constantly reevaluating. Just because you start up something doesn't mean you need to finish it. I think I feel pretty good about my trajectory, but I think in my own past, there have been plenty of times I turned around too early and didn't give myself the opportunity to let things be out. But that's going to be a really interesting balancing act for somebody who's newer to the sport, right? Because the way you form judgment is through bad decisions, right? And you make good decisions in the future because you get out of the bad decisions. So a mentor can help with that. But I know, talking about Nick Lodi, he thinks there's importance in figuring out for yourself how to bail, right? Don't always climb with a mentor. I think climb with people who are peers, climb with people who are mentors, climb with people who are going to force you to put the rope up. I think at times, if I had done more to kind of find that balance, it would have allowed me to more quickly develop some of the perspective that I have now, almost 20 years out.
Thanks so much for chatting.
This was a blast.
As this is our first episode, a big thanks to everyone who has supported the show so far. In particular, thank you. Thank you very much to our early supporters on Patreon: Anna, George, Laura, Margaret, Michael, Donna, and Daniel. Lastly, a big happy birthday to Gabriel Sciarra. If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on your podcast platform of choice, or support us on Patreon at patreon.com/icebeta. Ciao.